We can use this training for further training purposes. So that recording is started, and pass it off as we jump in to Gerald Floyd, if I can talk this morning. And he is from our statewide account receivable management, and he's going to start off the meeting. Yes.
Thank you, Amber. Again, my name is Gerald Floyd. I am the Statewide Accounts Receivable Management Coordinator here at the Department of Administrative Services in the Office of the State Controller. Happy to be here today to share with you some information on OAM 35.30.90 and the processing of DOR vendor garnishments. So before we begin, we wanted to share some background, kind of how did we get here? Why are we doing this? Secretary of State in past years, several times through various audits of the DAS and overall state accounts receivable management, that the state do state vendor offset. And so the concept has been around for several years, going back to 1997. And then in May of 2017, then Governor Brown issued an executive order that required state agencies to make efforts to recover liquidated and delinquent debt from entities to which those state agencies are remitting significant payments. So that kind of got the ball rolling with where we are today. It further required DAS to develop policies for state agencies to require the recoupment of liquidated and delinquent debt by means of reducing the agency's payments to those vendors. And so what started off as an executive order became OAM 35.30.90. So that's kind of why we are doing this process today. And so our agenda today, we're going to go over the OAM 35.30.90 along with a workflow to hopefully give you some visual cues as to how the process moves along. Then we will jump to the SFMS and the R-Stars process part 1, which includes several steps, including the data match between DOR and SFMA, the AP transaction processing, and the R-Stars security access. We'll then move to the Department of Revenue and their online system, and they'll cover security access, submitting the vendor information, the retrieving of the vendor submission response, and cover some frequently asked questions over that process. And then we'll wrap up with the DAS SFMS R-Stars process part 2, which is once you've received the response, how the AP transaction processing occurs based on that vendor submission response. So first of all, OAM 35.30.90, or the Oregon Accounting Manual, is where what we call vendor coordination, just for a short version. It includes the procedures by where the vendors that owe a debt to or is being collected by the Department of Revenue are identified in SFMA, and the steps that agencies need to follow if you're attempting to pay such a vendor that is on that list. And so this training will provide the details of how vendor coordination works. So the applicability of OAM 35.30.90 is for any debtor that has debts that may be collected via garnishment and are owed to or are being collected by the Department of Revenue. This centralizes the process through the one agency, making it a little bit easier to manage the process by being through the one agency and into SFMA, where the largest portion of state payments are made. So then agency management in the OAM is responsible for determining whether or not a vendor payment shall be garnished. Agencies are to use good judgment and independent thinking when determining whether or not to garnish. There are some statutory or regulatory, I should say, things to consider. Whether or not a particular funding would be subject to garnishment. That can include federal laws or regulations, the Oregon revised statutes, and subsequent administrative rules. There are the applying good judgment comes in on some things that aren't necessarily going to be called out in a statute, for example, and kind of the most common example that I could give of that would be an agency that has a vendor that is considered critical to the mission of the agency. And that vendor is like a sole provider of a good or a service. And without that vendor, the agency couldn't perform their mission. So that might be an example where, if the garnishment process moved forward, that vendor may choose not to provide those goods or services anymore. And so ultimately, if the agency makes that decision, then they need to document the reason for that decision so that if there's, audits later on that say, hey, we see that this vendor was owed a debt and was deactivated at the time, why didn't you submit this for a garnishment? You want to be able to document that. So that's kind of the applicability and some things to consider when you're going through this process that we'll be discussing today. Recently, OAM 35.30.90 was updated to include some procedures for the use of what are basically defined as an alternative payment method, primarily spots cards. And those procedures call for the agencies to adopt a transaction threshold. The OAM recommends a threshold of 10,000. You could choose a lesser value, for example, depending on your agency and the types of payments that you're making and using spots cards for. The goal with that threshold was to kind of begin to close the loophole that spots cards, not going through the SFMA process, would begin to close that loophole, but not make it overly burdensome that every spots card purchase that's made follow the process where when an agency plans to use that alternative payment method, and in this case, the payment exceeds the threshold, the agency must first check the SFMA vendor profile. And if the profile is active or the vendor is not in SFMA, then you continue with your alternative payment method. The vendor does not owe a debt, or because they have not been set up in SFMA, the match process has not yet occurred. So you go ahead and continue with that. However, if that vendor profile is inactive and the note says to contact Department of Revenue, then you don't use your alternative payment method and instead make your entries into SFMA and follow the process that's outlined in OAM 35.30.90. So that's kind of some new pieces from 2024, updates that were made to begin to close the loophole so that large payments being made using spots cards, that we're at least checking to see if there is a debt that is owed to the state that we need to be looking at and following the process for looking to see if the garnishment process can recoup some of those funds. So next we're on slide 8 for those of you that may need to know. This is a visual workflow that we put together. You'll notice there's color coding on the legend. This is kind of to define kind of where the process is occurring or who's initiating that process. And so we begin with the DOR providing a nightly file of debtors to SFMA that is then matched against the vendors in SFMA. And so any that are a match, SFMA inactivates that vendor based on that file from DOR. And that inactivation reason is then flagged as contact DOR. So then when the agency is beginning to make a payment and they go into SFMA and they see that that vendor is deactivated, you'll review the 5152 screen for the details to see that the reason is the please contact DOR. Please note that there can be other reasons that a vendor could be inactivated. Just could be that they haven't been paid in a significant period of time. So that's why you review the screen and see that it's to contact Department of Revenue. So at this point, this is where the agency makes that determination if the payment is subject to the garnishment. We kind of talked about some of those things that you would consider, the criticality of the vendor to the agency mission, the various regulations and statutes that would determine whether or not that payment may or may not be subject to garnishment. There are exempt properties from garnishment that are listed in ORS 18, for example. So at this point, once you've made that determination, we have two routes that we can go. One is that the payment is not subject to garnishment, or that it is. And so now, if it's not subject to garnishment, then the agency would send the request to SFMS to activate the vendor, and you complete the payment like you would if it hadn't been inactivated in the beginning. But if it is subject to garnishment, then you will enter the vendor information into Revenue Online, and Chantel will be discussing that process a little bit later. And once that is in Revenue Online, then DOR processes that submitted information, and then the determination is DOR going to issue the garnishment or not. There can be reasons why a vendor was deactivated, but by the time your information is coming to them, there could have been, for example, some other form of payment that paid that debt, that just the timing kind of coincided. And DOR may say, well, we don't need to issue that garnishment because now the debt has been paid. So if DOR did not issue a garnishment, or that response comes back as no garnishment, then again, you would send your request to SFMS to activate the vendor and complete your payment. But if DOR does issue the garnishment, then you're going to create the mail code 444 in SFMA, and Liz will talk about that shortly, and notify the SFMA vendor desk to do that activation of that mail code. And so once SFMS activates the vendor code mail code 444, then the determination needs to be looking at the garnishment and the amount of the payment to determine if the garnishment is more than the amount of the payment owed. This kind of just determines how your entries are going to go into SFMA. So let's start with the no path here. And so in this case, the garnishment is not more than the payment owed. So you're going to enter the amount of the garnishment to the 444 mail code, and you're going to include the garnishment ID in the invoice description field, and then you will enter the balance of the payment owed to the vendor mail code. So two payments will be issued, one to the 444, which is the redirect to the Department of Revenue. The second path is the garnishment is more than the amount that's owed. So in that case, the yes path, you're going to enter the payment and garnishment amount to the 444 mail code. There's no balance to be paid to the vendor in this case. So you'll enter the garnishment ID in the invoice description field, And both of these routes end up with those payments being sent to DOR, who will then post the payment that they receive to the agency, from the agency to the debt that is owed. And at that point, if the payment results in the debt being paid in full, then DOR will update that nightly debtor file to flag that the SFMS will then reactivate that vendor profile because they're no longer on the debtor list. So this is, again, just a workflow, kind of a high level of what are the major steps. And the rest of the training today will kind of go into the more detail or technical aspects of how you complete those steps. So with that, we'll pause and see if anyone has any questions about the OAM workflow general processes.
We do have a question, Gerald. Just are the yes/no options on the flowchart backwards? If the amount owed is greater than the garnishment, wouldn't we have to split the payment?
Let me see here. So if the garnishment is more than the amount of the payment, so in this case, if you had a garnishment of 10,000, but a payment of 5, then the answer is yes, you're entering your $5,000 payment as one payment to the 444 mail code. Whereas if it was the opposite, if you had a payment of 10,000, but the garnishment was 5, then the answer is no, and you're going to enter the $5,000 garnishment to the 444 mail code, and then the balance of the remaining 5,000 would be paid to the vendor.
Thank you for the clarification. I have another question. It says, we often see vendors already activated by the time DOR responds, even though DOR indicates there's an active garnishment. Is it just a timing issue? I'm not sure if that's your question or if we'll go over that later. You know?
I would defer that to Chantel's portion, but I would suspect that a lot of that is a timing issue. And again, because it is a nightly process that updates that vendor, you could already be in the process of, you submitted it, they're processing your garnishment, or another garnishment might have come in. And so there's lots of things that they look at and would determine whether or not they're going to send you a garnishment based on the information you have entered. But we'll let Chantel cover that portion.
Perfect. Sounds like Chantel's got a lot. We also, it says, can we put the garnishment ID in the description field and not in the invoice field? We have to track all vendor case information for our agency in the invoice field to track in SFMA. And I'm not sure, again, maybe that's a Liz question, but
yeah.
Okay, perfect. We will certainly, we're going to defer that one till later. If your question doesn't get answered, please ask again if we don't, but I'm sure Liz is watching and we'll make sure that that gets answered. Is there any more questions?
While we're waiting to see if there's anything else in the chat, I see Chantel said that was correct about the timing issue. The question about the garnishment ID in the description field and the invoice field, Gerald, I wanted to clarify, are you running any queries or information on that specific invoice field? Because from the SFMA perspective, it could be put in either, but I wouldn't want it to throw off any reporting that the swarm group is doing on that garnishment or that DOR is doing.
I will be honest, this could be when I was putting that together, I was going off of potentially some older information. The important thing is that the payment that goes to DOR, that it denotes that garnishment ID, because the critical piece is their posting of that payment. If it's not on that check that they receive, they can't actually tie it to the garnishment that was issued to sort of connect the dots, if you will, which from a reporting perspective does kind of impact us a little bit. We do monitor the payments that are made using the 444 mail code versus the payments that are posted by DOR and try to reconcile those as best we can. So if DOR doesn't have that garnishment ID, it's not going to show up on their query as a garnishment payment, that then we can see that that was from the vendor coordination process, which might lead to a little more research being done to figure out, where did that payment go? So as long as the payment is or that garnishment ID is visible on the payment so that they can post it correctly, that's the important piece. Which field, I'll let you help them figure out which one that is in SFMA directly.
Okay. Thank you, Jared.
Okay, well, I do not see any more questions. So next we have Elizabeth Schultz from the SFMS unit.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Gerald. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad we could have this joint training with DOR and SWARM to try to give more information about this process. And, the questions in the chat are great. Please keep them coming. We want to make sure that this is a useful training for you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today the R-stars piece of this DOR vendor garnishment process. When I say R-stars, you may also hear it referred to as SFMA. Same thing, it's the accounting system. Different people may refer to it under different terms. I think we've got R-stars and SFMA in these slides, but just know that that's just the accounting system. It's the same for the purposes of this presentation. So moving forward to our first slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about that initial part of the process that Gerald went over in the workflow. So behind the scenes, we did set up some SFMA programming. What the system is doing is it's picking up that debtor list daily from DOR. It's comparing it to the prior day's file. It's making any updates. So automatically each night, the system is reviewing the updated DOR debtor list and inactivating any vendors that are on that list and reactivating any vendors that have dropped off the list. So we'll kind of show what that looks like on the 52 screen, but that's just behind the scenes programming that's happening. As far as agency accounts payable users, most often you're going to be encountering this when you're actually trying to enter a payment transaction into the accounting system, or if you're looking at a vendor profile, you will see that message of please contact DOR. So typically for an agency, that's your first notification that you have to go through this process, and there is a potential DOR vendor garnishment. So slide 14, this is an example from R-stars of what you would actually see if you were entering in a voucher payable transaction for a vendor. If it had been inactivated, you would get a message at the bottom letting you know that the vendor is not in an active status. It won't pull in the associated vendor name and vendor address because that vendor is inactive. In this example that we have on the screen, this batch is being entered in a batch edit mode 2. And I will talk about batch edit modes a little bit in this presentation. Let me know if you have questions on what batch edit modes are. There is specific functionality in the accounting system that controls when edits are being performed. So I will mention this. The examples we'll be looking at are batch edit mode 2. So that's why on this slide, that mode edit and post is in red to indicate you would get this error if you're trying to enter a batch in edit mode 2. So this may be your first notification that there's an issue. As Gerald mentioned, there could be other reasons that the vendor is inactive. So just because you see these error messages at the bottom of your transaction doesn't necessarily mean that this is due to a DOR vendor garnishment issue. We have to go to the vendor profile to confirm that. So on this next slide, slide number 15, we have some dummy data here. This isn't real information. We don't have a Mickey Mouse vendor set up in our system, but this is what the 52 screen would look like for one of these vendors. We've got a couple of things highlighted in red in here. The first I'm going to mention is that please contact DOR message right in the middle of the screen. It's the fourth line of the address. That is what tells you that this is related to the DOR vendor garnishment process and that you need to contact DOR for next steps on this. So we'll talk about that. This lets you know this is the reason the vendor is inactive. On the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that status code is I. So it is in inactive status. We'll see about halfway down the screen, the update by, normally that's an individual person, but because we have that behind the scenes programming, that's the name of the job that does this automatic inactivation. So you'll see DAF-J DOR, which means that behind the scenes programming inactivated this vendor. In this example, we have the tax ID number. Again, not a real tax ID number here. If you have the appropriate user security in RSTARS or SFMA, you'll be able to see this information. We restrict it to only those people that need this information. So if you don't have the correct user class, you're not going to see anything there. Those that are processing accounts payable transactions by default would have this access. So this is what you would see on the 52 screen to indicate that this vendor was inactivated because it's on the DOR debtor list. So at this point, once you've identified that you have a vendor, you want to make a payment to them, but they are inactive and they have that please contact DOR message on their profile, the agency needs to determine whether or not the payment is subject to garnishment. Gerald already went through some examples and considerations agencies should make, documenting that logic as well if there's going to be, if it's going to be reviewed later. So for example, we've got a couple of examples. There's definitely more. Workers' compensation payments, unemployment benefits are not subject to garnishment. If you take a look at ORS 18.845, there's some more examples in there that will identify specific types of payments that are not subject to garnishment. Federal grant payments are also not subject to garnishment, and federal fund payments that are not affiliated with the grant may be subject to garnishment. So there is some discretion here, reviewing what the activity is for. Does it meet one of the exceptions? So that's really the process to figure out, do we need to do a garnishment on this payment, or is it exempt, and do we have something to support that? If the payment is not subject to garnishment, what you will do at that point, you need to make a payment to the vendor. You've already determined you don't need to garnish it. It has an exclusion from that. You will send a request to the SFMS vendor desk asking for that vendor to be temporarily activated so you can process a payment to them. You're going to enter the accounts payable transaction the same way you normally would. Since we're just temporarily activating the vendor, we're just activating it for that day. And if that vendor is still on the DOR debtor list, it's going to become inactive tomorrow. So we want to enter that transaction in RSTARS with an edit mode 2. That means it'll post immediately as soon as you save it to make sure it goes through. We don't want to have it hung up because the vendor's inactivated again overnight. So you would request the vendor desk to activate it. Once it's active, you would enter your transaction, release it, and it'll process that night. If the vendor is still on the DOR debtor list, that vendor profile will go back to an inactive status the following morning. So if the payment is subject to garnishment, that's when you need to take that step of notifying DOR of the debtor-vendor match via Revenue Online. So there's a couple different paths here. The one thing I do want to mention as well on RSTARS security, when you report that to DOR to see if they're going to issue a garnishment letter, you do have to have the vendor's social security number or employer identification number included in the notification. So when we were looking at that 52 screen, there is the tax ID number. That's what contains either the SSN or the EIN for the vendor. If you have the appropriate user class security, you'll be able to see that. So you can get that information that you need to report to DOR for this vendor. We automatically grant access to user classes listed here to be able to see that tax ID number. If you have any questions about user security, how to request access, each agency is designated an agency security officer that manages and reviews access to the RSTAR system and makes requests for access. So you could find out your agency security officer, consult with them if you have any questions on that. But it's only limited to certain people that can see that information, but you're going to need that information to report the information in Revenue Online. So if we take a look, this is the RSTAR security screen, the 96A screen. If you have the appropriate access in RSTARS, you can see this. All of the agency security officers would have this level of access. And we have about halfway down on the right-hand side of the screen, there is an indicator whether or not that user class can view TIN info, tax ID number info on those screens. So for those user classes I mentioned on the prior slides, those will allow you to view that tax ID info. Moving forward to slide 19, here again is our 52 screen. We are in user class 17, so that tax ID number would show up on the screen, highlighted in red text there. So that's where you would get that information. So that's the first part of the RSTARS process, basically everything to figure out, do you have a potential garnishment? Do you need to reach out to DOR and go through the Revenue Online process? I will be back again later in this presentation to say what we'll do in RSTARS after you hear back from DOR. But at this point, are there any questions on this initial piece of the process or anything that we've talked about so far?
Liz, we've had a bunch of questions, but Gerald's answered them, most of them in the chat. I do hear from some people that we are stuck on slide 16. It should be on the private view, and you should be able to, at the bottom of your screen, move it along. If you cannot, feel free. We're gonna, there's one more question, and I'm gonna read it off for you in just a second. And then we're going to take a break. So just to stretch your feet. So it would be an appropriate time, jump out of the meeting, jump back in and see if it works. And it looks like Gerald has that question too.
Okay.
Is there any more questions in the chat then, or? I know it's kind of hard because seems like there is a lot of questions about this subject, but they're going to be covered in some of the next sessions. So I know we have time at the end too, and we'll get to hear from Liz again and ask her some more questions if we need to.
Okay, and I just wanted to check, I can see a comment in here if there were some pauses and gaps. I'm not sure if there's some connectivity issues. We are recording this training. We do have copies of the slides that are sent out. So please let me know if you're not getting the information. You can always reach out and let me know. I can go over some of this information too. But if you're having technical difficulties, please let us know. As Amber mentioned, sometimes it does help to leave the meeting and come back. So just want to make sure we're not seeing lots of technical difficulties with being able to hear the information in the presentation.
We do have one more question. Are you seeing any issues using Oregon buys? We may not know if there's a vendor on the DOR list until it errors out the following day on the 530 screen.
Yes, that is a great question, Jenny. When we're talking about batch edit modes, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the second part of this presentation, Oregon buys, there's kind of two touch points with the DOR garnishment process in Oregon Buys. The first is when we inactivate vendors. When we inactivate vendors in RSTARS, we also send extracts of all valid vendors to Oregon Buys. So if we've inactivated them, in Oregon Buys, that vendor is going to be inactive. So you're not going to be able to select it on transactions. So that's what vendors or what agencies see sometimes is they aren't able to select that vendor in Oregon Buys because it's in inactive status. And in that case, if they need to process a payment and go through the DOR garnishment process, you can look up the vendor in RSTARS, see why it's inactive. If it says, please contact DOR, you would still follow the same process to determine if it's garnishable or not, whether or not you need to send more information to DOR. And that garnishment payment would have to be processed directly in RSTARS rather than through Oregon Buys, just because of the timing of it. The other thing that we see is what you're mentioning of the transaction goes through, and because of the timing of the vendor being inactivated, it gets to the 5:30 screen, and the following morning you have those errors. In that case, any interface batch, whether it's from Oregon Buys or another subsystem, they use a different batch edit mode. So they're not actually trying to post the transaction until that evening when the vendor has already become inactive. So in that situation, what we recommend is you would still go through the same process to see, is the payment subject to garnishment? Do you need to report it to revenue and get a garnishment letter? And then you should delete the transaction from the 5:30 screen from that batch. So if Oregon Buys sent it over, you would delete that line item, and then you would enter the garnishment payment directly in RSTARS with an edit mode 2. And you can make a note in Oregon Buys that you had to do this. It's just because of the timing, because if you try to process it through any interface batch, it's going to try to post it in the evening after the vendor's already been inactivated. So that is the recommendation from the Oregon Buys team on how to handle that. There may be different objects or different options that you can use. I see Antonia has a suggestion of how they're handling it forestry. But there is an Oregon Buys flowchart on the garnishment process. If you're interested in seeing that, send me an email and I can send that out on what the recommended guidance is for garnishment payments and Oregon Buys.
And then Liz, do you know how much the debt minimum is to be on the debtor list?
I do not. That would be a question maybe Chantel would be able to answer.
I'll get there. Okay, perfect. So we're going to get back to that. We saw that question, and I'm sure that after the break, Chantel will answer that. Okay. At this point, it is just almost 9:40. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break and be back at 9:50. Again, we will have some more question and answer times throughout so that we can get all of those things answered from the right person. So, all right, we're going to take a break. Thank you. All right, we are back from our break, and you're going to hear from Chantel at Department of Revenue. Chantel, if you want to tell me when you want to move the slides forward, then I can do that. Although when you just move the slide forward to the DOR, did you have control before?
Yes.
It did move. So
okay. Can I test it real quick? Can you tell me if it moves again?
Absolutely. I'm gonna have to take control back from me. I have it, but
hold on. I'm going to push take control again. Perfect. And so we were on break time. Did it move for everybody?
Moved back to break time. Yep.
Excellent. Well, I think we figured it out. It might have been our VPN because it's our security access. So it might have been stopping us from being able to move the slides. So I disconnected and looks like it is working now. That's awesome.
Perfect. Well then, if people don't see it moving forward, just let me know in the chat and we'll fix it. But looks like we're set to go. All right.
Sounds good. Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Chantel Collier-Nin. I work for the Oregon Department of Revenue. I work for the Collection Division. I have worked for Revenue for almost 20 years, and I have enjoyed learning about the vendor garnishment process in the last year. And I have been working with my coworkers, Leigh Hyman-Tevis and Kelly Cox. They are our team members that assist with our state vendor garnishment inbox, questions regarding access, any questions or issues you have with the vendor process. We are your representatives for that. So anyway, welcome to training. And we are really hoping that the training we provide to you guys today can meet your needs. And so we'll get started. So we're going to talk a little bit about our outline here real quick. We're going to talk about security access, getting to Revenue Online, submitting vendor information, retrieving the vendor submission response, and frequently asked questions. So again, just like you've been doing throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to it. If for some reason we can't answer your question, I will, Leigh is taking down some notes and we will definitely reply back to you after the training today. So moving on. Security access for Revenue Online. There are two types of login types available on Revenue Online. So each agency should have one user login with administrator rights that's set up by Department of Revenue. That login will be able to cease or manage additional logins for their agency. If your administrator is managing additional logins, it's important to understand the types of access. We have the administrator, which can change or cease or manage. And then we also have the account manager, which is the more typical logon type. This access type allows users to perform actions on behalf of the accounts that they have access to and view any corresponding information that is associated with that account. If you do not have access and you need to obtain access, get to the right slide here. Oops, sorry. For new account managers to obtain access to the vendor payment or vendor garnishment program, please have your administrator send an email to our state vendor matching inbox with the following: your agency name, the person's name who is requesting access, their email address and contact phone number. We need those identifiers to be able to set up the login for you. And then Department of Revenue will send an email to the new account manager with your first time login steps and a temporary password. And that will enable you to change that and set up security questions if you wish to, and also allow you to set up two-factor authentication if you would like to do that. So we're going to refer to the following steps to see what that actually looks like on Revenue Online. So your administrator logs into Revenue Online, and from the login section, you're going to click that More Options tab. From the access management section, you're going to click the hyperlink that it says manage access. And then to change the access type for the specific account manager, click on the account manager hyperlink. To cancel any account manager's access, you can click on the cancel access hyperlink. And once it's clicked, it should change that hyperlink to read grant access. So if you did it by accident or you need to grant access again, you can simply click on that and it will change to the grant access, back to the grant access hyperlink. Now we're going to move into vendor payment notification. So this is when you are looking to access revenue online to be able to obtain information. We're going to go to the www.oregon.gov/DOR, and you're going to click on that Revenue Online button at the top of the screen. Revenue Online opens, and you're going to enter your username and password provided to you by DOR. You're not able to click the don't have a login. It's not an access that is able to be set up by you individually. It does have to be set up by Department of Revenue. Once you've logged into Revenue Online, you're going to be in the screen that's giving you basic agency information. And from the Summary tab, you're going to click on, you're going to look at the Garnishment Access section, and you're going to click on the Submit Vendor Information hyperlink, which is under the number 2 there. By default, the customer level name and address are pre-populated for the agency, but agency information may be overridden if you need to. Due to the response being returned electronically, it's not required to override any of that information. Then we're into the if your agency information and mailing address are correct, you can go ahead and just click next. You can enter your vendor's information here on this vendor submission screen. You're going to enter the vendor name as it appears in your system. You're going to select through that drop down right there the appropriate ID type. So if you're using an SSN or an FEIN, a Federal Employer Identification Number, you're going to enter that information there, and then you're going to enter the total amount payable to the vendor. Once Department of Revenue processes your request, you will receive an email confirmation instructing you to access Revenue Online to view the results. So you're going to log into Revenue Online again, and from the Action Center tab, you're going to click on that View Messages hyperlink. You're going to click the subject hyperlink for the message you'd like to view, and this will open the message window. If Department of Revenue issued a garnishment or they've ordered one, a PDF will be included in the attachment section of the message. And if a garnishment has not been ordered, you can proceed to processing your payment. If you have any questions regarding your web message, you can contact the agent via their email address listed in the signature block of the web notice. And if a payment is being sent to DOR through a garnishment, the garnishment ID, I think we described this previously, from the garnishment must be referenced in the invoice description field. And then additional information about this will be discussed once we turn it back over to Elizabeth. She's got some more information about that. And we're already into the frequently asked questions. So I tried to glean some of the questions that we frequently get in the state vendor email box. A lot of people sometimes send emails directly to me or other members of the team. We do want you to send any questions to the state vendor matching box simply because that makes sure if I'm somehow out of office or I change jobs, there's somebody there that can answer your question. So make sure we get timely responses out to you. It also helps us track what type of questions. And in this instance, we were actually able to add a little bit more to our training presentation because we were seeing a lot of the same questions that were not addressed in the original training presentation. Sorry about that. Let's see. What do I do if the vendor's garnishment payment is more than the amount listed on the garnishment? And we did kind of review a little bit of this in a previous question, but we would ask that you submit the amount necessary to satisfy the amount on the garnishment to Department of Revenue. Any remaining funds should be remitted to your vendor. And another question that was similar to that is what happens if something gets overpaid? Department of Revenue will refund if anything, will refund out to the vendor if anything is overpaid on their account. Some next questions is, do I need to send a copy of the garnishment to the vendor? No. Department of Revenue automatically sends a copy when a garnishment is ordered, so they should receive their copy as well. What do I do if the vendor tells me that the amount due on the garnishment has already been paid? I just want to verify with you that agents thoroughly review vendor accounts before issuing a garnishment. So you can direct the vendor to contact Department of Revenue if they believe that the balance is not due. Our contact information is located on our website, so they are welcome to go there and look at all of the options that are available on our website. What are my responsibilities regarding garnishments issued by DOR? I get a lot of frequent questions about what do I need to do? How do I respond to this? A lot of those direct questions can be answered on our webpage under the selection of, excuse me, understanding your role as a garnishee, and I went ahead and put the link there in the slide. Excuse me. I still see a hold in stars SFMA in a vendor profile even after a garnishment was issued. Why does this happen? I apologize. Examples where this might happen is a vendor may have had a new debt in her collections, or the prior garnishment didn't pay the balance in full. So there are definitely certain situations, but please be assured that our agents are checking the account at the time that you submit the vendor information in Revenue Online. So whatever is showing at that particular point in time is the reason why they issue a garnishment or they don't. Okay, let's see. Are there any questions?
Chantel, did you answer what is the minimum debt to be on the debtor list? Do you know?
Yes, the minimum debt is Department of Revenue's threshold is $25. So anything over the $25 amount at garnishment would be issued.
Perfect. And then I think the other question in all of this that isn't answered, and maybe you did, sorry, I was checking to see what was off on the slide presentation, but does DOR remove the vendor? Like, when do they move it? Is it when you send us a letter or when you get the payment from the agency?
When we receive payment.
Perfect. And then
just to clarify, when DOR receives the payment and that payment results in the debt being paid in full.
Correct. Yes. Thank you, Gerald.
Thanks, Gerald. We have another question. If we submitted vendor information and are waiting on a response from DOR and the vendor has another payment the next day, do you want us to submit the vendor information again?
I would say yes to that question at this time, but I can verify that and answer that directly to the participant. I'm sorry, I can't see the name, but I can verify
Jill
that with with Jill. Yes. I would believe that yes, you would, because in those instances where they might have new debt come onto the system. It can literally be the next day they have something brand new that's owing. So I would say, and again too, if anything overpays, we would be able to refund out to the vendor.
And then the garnishment, is it going to take the whole amount of the payment, or is there a percentage of the payment ever that it takes?
That's a good question. So these are not wage garnishments. In the instance of a wage garnishment, it would be a percentage. So these are one-time 100% garnishments. So for the full amount that you have available up to payment in full on the balance.
Perfect. Is there any more questions for Chantel? She is going to stay on the whole time with us. So if you have any more questions, there'll be some time at the end.
I do see one more question. Looks like Antonia says, I resubmitted the vendor and got a new garnishment ID. Again, that can happen. And there are instances where new debt might be the same amount. It just depends on how that timeline crosses during the process. It could be for the same amount. And again, I will say that if anything overpays, they will go ahead and refund out.
Okay. All right. Well, at this point, we're going to go ahead and refund the vendor, correct? Right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Perfect. Make sure the money
Okay.
gets where it needs to go. So we're going to move on to Elizabeth then, and with some more from the SFMS.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. There is one more question. I may have jumped ahead a little bit too early to DAS SFMS. The last question I see is, other than the vendor paying in full or the agency submitting garnished payment in full, can the vendor be removed from the list?
Yes, there can be times when somebody might be removed. Let's say they file bankruptcy, or they are maybe they came in and made payment in full before they had anything issued. So yes, that can happen. Correct.
Thank you.
Chantel?
Go ahead, Gerald.
So one question, I think I know the answer to this, but my understanding is also if somebody contacts DOR and initiates a payment plan for their balance, that they're considered compliant, which kind of takes away the necessity for the future garnishment, so long as they stay current on that payment plan that they agree to.
That is correct. Yes, I forgot about that option.
That'd be another reason they could be removed, because that next night
Yes.
in the update, they're considered compliant, so they would be removed.
Right. And then let's say they don't make their payment and their payment plan breaks. That could be the reason why you keep seeing the inactivation, activation, inactivation, activation. And it's for maybe the same amount. Maybe they didn't make the first payment on their payment plan and it broke. So. Carla, you had a question. It says, we have several vendors that are still showing inactive even though they are on a plan. So a lot of times there might be confusion. I would refer the vendor to call or contact Department of Revenue in those instances if they feel that they're on a payment plan and for some reason they're still showing up inactive in your system.
It's also a question, is the vendor notified of when an agency pays an invoiced amount that has been garnished?
Well, they would be notified through their copy of the garnishment. So that's our way of notifying them that they've been garnished. I don't know if you issue anything. I don't think that you do out to them.
Thanks, Chantel.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. These questions are great. Looking at, what we budgeted for our training time this morning and what we have left for slides, we are going to have plenty of time left over. So if you've got questions, keep them coming. That's kind of the point of this training, is to make sure we're answering your questions on this process. So I'm going to continue on with the next section of the slides on the RSTARS process. So if you've got questions about anything we've went over so far, keep putting them in the chat, and we can continue answering those questions after this section. So once you've gone through that process that Chantel described, getting the information, getting that into Revenue Online, then we get back to our process flow of what you need to do in the accounting system. So for this part 2, there's kind of 2 different options. The question is, did DOR issue a garnishment or not? So if DOR does not issue a garnishment, you're not going to have to garnish that payment. The vendor profile is still inactive in our system. So what you're going to need to do is send a request to the SFMS vendor desk requesting the vendor profile to be temporarily activated. Once that profile is temporarily activated, you'll be able to enter your transaction as you would normally enter it for that vendor. Again, we always recommend using an edit mode 2 batch. On that day, the vendor is temporarily active to allow that transaction to process. So I saw some questions of, you've seen vendors showing inactive and active. Some of that could be, another agency is trying to process a payment to that vendor, so they've requested be temporarily activated. But it will be restored to an inactive status that evening when we do the DOR debtor list process to update vendor profiles. So for that case, if there's no garnishment, the only step you really need to do is get that vendor active and then as normal. Now, if DOR does issue a garnishment, there's additional steps your agency needs to take. The first is setting up a mail code for that vendor to be able to direct the payment to DOR. So you're going to create a mail code 444. All of the DOR mail codes use that same numbering. So you would set up a mail code 444 for that vendor, and you're going to use that mail code to process the amount that's to be garnished from that vendor. So on the next slide, we have an example of what your setup should look like. And this is showing you exactly the information that you would need to set up on the 51 screen to do this. So it would be whoever is designated in your agency to request vendor profile setups. You would set up a brand new mail code. In this, our prior example, we had showed Mickey Mouse. We're still continuing with Mickey Mouse. We're using that same vendor number, but we're setting up a new mail code 444. In the name underneath, it's going to be Department of Revenue. You want to follow all of that information that's highlighted in red is what you're going to enter on that mail code 444, so that we can track that this is a payment for the Mickey Mouse vendor that was actually garnished by DOR. So once you set that up, when you save it as the agency user that has access to establish these, it will be in a status code R, which means it needs to be reviewed before you can use it. So once you've set that up, you will notify the SFMS vendor desk that the mail code 444 is ready for activation. It needs to be activated so you can process your payment. So once that is activated, you'll enter the payment transaction. So we recommend that garnishment ID. It needs to be on the transaction, ideally in that invoice description field. The description field is where we want that information. For that garnishment ID that's on the DOR garnishment letter, just so you have that audit trail of what the purpose of this payment is, and you can track it to a specific garnishment ID. If it's a partial payment, so if you've got a payment for $1,000, but you only need to garnish $500 for it, you are going to enter 2 lines for this voucher payable. Your first line is going to be to mail code 444 for that garnishment amount of $500. The second line will be to the normal mail code you use for that vendor. So part of it the 500 will be sent to DOR. The remaining amount that's not going to be garnished is going to be sent to the vendor as normal. Agencies have asked this question in the past, so we have this kind of note here. The system automatically inactivates vendors, but it doesn't automatically set up the mail code 444. We looked at this when we were looking at the programming for this process, but that could potentially be a lot of mail codes being set up that are never going to be used. So if you have this situation where you have a vendor, it's been activated, you've got the garnishment letter, and you don't see any mail code 444 was previously set up for it, you would need to set that up following the normal process to set up a new mail code for the vendor. So this is an example of a garnishment letter. There's no sensitive information on here. It's just to kind of give you an idea of where you find that garnishment ID on the letter, because you're going to need to enter that on the transaction you enter into RStars. So if we look at the bottom right-hand corner of this sample, you'll see something, garnishment ID. You'll also see a letter ID under there. The garnishment ID is the tracking number that you want to input into the accounting system to tie this. And I do see a question in the chat. When we're talking about having two line items, the garnishment amount for 500 to mail code 444, and then the separate item just to the vendor for the remaining amount. The question is, should you use the same doc number for both transactions, one to each mail code? Yes, you can do that. You can have suffix 001 to mail code 444, and you can have suffix 002 to the regular mail code. You don't have to. If you want to create separate document numbers, you can, but you can put them on the same document number and just use different current document suffixes for those line items. So this is an example of what your payment entry would look like for the mail code 444 side. Same as any other voucher that you would enter into the accounting system, but when you put that information in there for the description, you want the DOR garnishment ID listed there. So that's that ID from the letter. You want to put that information in there so you can track it. How this payment to DOR ties back to the specific garnishment. You'll have your vendor number, but you'll use mail code 444. So when it pulls in the information on the address, you're going to see DOR's information. And that's what we want, because we want this payment to go to DOR. So when you're processing these, we're temporarily putting the vendor in active status. They may revert back to an inactive status the next day if they're still on the DOR list. So when you're entering these, again, we recommend edit mode 2 directly in RStars is the best process to make sure that your transaction doesn't get unnecessarily hung up. Make sure you don't have a future due date. You want a current due date so that it's not waiting on the 5:30 screen to hit that due date, because then if the vendor is inactive at that point, your batch is going to hang up and that payment is going to be delayed. Again, our recommendation is if the payment is in an interfaced batch, this would be Oregon Buys or any other subsystem that interfaces payments to RStars, we recommend entering another payment transaction in RStars with edit mode 2 and deleting it from the interface batch. Using that edit mode 2, just make sure that it posts correctly, it does all its edit checking, and we won't have a situation where it's waiting for you the following morning on the 5:30 screen because the vendor went back to inactive status. Vendor profiles will inactivate following batch processing that night if the debtor is still on the DOR debtor list. So you do have to ask the vendor desk to temporarily activate that vendor profile so you can process this transaction. But if that vendor has not dropped off the DOR list, you'll see it in inactive status again the next day. DOR will remove debtors from the debtor list when debts are paid in full or the other circumstances that were mentioned earlier. And SFMA will automatically activate vendor profiles once the vendor is removed for the debtor list. So we're doing that comparison every day. We're getting a copy of the most up-to-date debtor list from DOR. So once that vendor is no longer on there, it will be active and function as normal in the system. So I do see a couple questions in the chat that I can go ahead and answer now. The first is, if the vendor is activated, but it's actually for another agency to make a non-payment not subject to garnishment, how would we know that? If we are awaiting a response yet from our DOR submission, do we wait to make payment? So, you know, there is that potential risk. We are temporarily opening up those vendor profiles. So you may not see that error on your voucher payable transaction if it's open for another reason. You would still see the contact DOR message on the profile. That would not be removed. If you have a garnishment in process, you would still follow the process as outlined. You would still report it to Revenue Online. If you got a garnishment letter, you would still process the garnishment even if the vendor has become active later. As Chantel mentioned, if the garnishment, if there's an overpayment, it will be returned to the vendor through DOR. So you're still following the process as normal. Another question, can we use something in the invoice number field still for the 444 mail code just for reporting purposes later out of OB? Yes, we need in the invoice description, we want that garnishment ID, but if you have some other specific tracking that you want to do for your agency, you can use that as well.
There was, Liz, there was one more question up a ways in the chat, and it says that they were asking if we are garnishing just the services or the whole invoice if they're out-of-pocket expenses as well, which I don't know what kind of case that would be, but do you know, is there any restrictions on the invoice of what we could garnish, or is it just all subject to garnishment? That might be a Chantel question.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about when you're looking at the payment, whether or not it's something that should be garnished or not. And agency management is determining, you know, if it's a federal grant payment, it's not subject to garnishment, some of those things. Chantel, do you have any more information on that? Or Sandra, do you have any more detail on that question of, are we garnishing just the services or the whole invoice if there are out-of-pocket expenses as well?
I think you could probably put that on the questions that need to be looked into. I am not certain of that answer. I have an idea, but not certain.
Okay. So looking through the chats, we've got some more questions about the activation request for mail code 444 needs to be on the vendor change request form or an email. You would follow the same process you normally do for activation. So if you've got a new mail code and you're just adding a 444, you're not changing the existing mail code. You can just send an email to the vendor desk, call the vendor desk, and ask it to be activated. If there was already a mail code 444 and then you're trying to change data that's on that existing mail code, you would want to use the vendor change request form. So moving forward to the next slide, just some miscellaneous information here. If there is a vendor dispute related to the garnishment, that information, those disputes shall be directed to DORs because they are managing that vendor garnishment process. SFMS staff is not monitoring vendor garnishments that are issued by DOR. We're not tracking that information. And agencies are not to send the DOR garnishment paperwork to SFMS. We don't need that information when you're requesting a vendor to be temporarily activated or requesting a mail code 444 to be activated. And you should keep that garnishment paperwork that you receive as supporting documentation for your payment transaction. So you want to have that as your backup for your voucher payable transaction. All right. So we are at the question slide. I know I tried to go through and answer some of the questions I saw in the chat, but we've got plenty of time. So if you've got more questions on anything that we went over or something that we didn't cover, please let us know. Gerald, Chantel, and I are all here to be able to answer questions on the entire process.
I just wanted to kind of put my 2 cents to that last question about the garnishment if there are out-of-pocket expenditures. Typically, the garnishment, unless it is something that is specified like in ORS 18 as certain property not subject to garnishment, but that is usually things like the benefits programs, the unemployment that was mentioned earlier, things like that. In this case, the agency has funds that it is to be paid unless the nature of those funds meet one of those criteria in statute. It would be the 100% garnishment. You would send the whole payment to DOR if the garnishment or the payment is less than the garnishment amount. When they receive the notice of the garnishment, it has instructions if there are on how they would challenge that garnishment, and that is through DOR. So this is why Liz just mentioned that if there's a dispute, you refer it to DOR, because DOR is now responsible for managing that process because they become the custodian of those funds, so to speak. And so if through that challenge of garnishment, they can basically show, hey, this is a recovery of out-of-pocket expenditures, and that is something that DOR in that challenge process deems, okay, we're not going to take those. That's where DOR would issue that refund of that portion, but it's not necessarily something that I would say that the agency would typically want to get into, trying to break out portions of payments unless it is those things that are, like we said before, federal grant payments, things like that. If it is identified in statute as exempt property from garnishment, things like that, that you don't send, but otherwise let the challenge process do what it's supposed to do in statute. And with that, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning, kind of the history of this, Secretary of State has made recommendations that the state implement a vendor offset program. And you'll notice we're not doing an offset. Offset would be, hey, we're just taking this money between these two agencies, and we're not doing the garnishment per se. There was a very conscious decision made by the implementation team after the executive order came out that we were going to use garnishments because there is a very defined process in statute that gives the debtor all of the abilities to have the legal recourse. We follow all the legal processes for the issuance of the garnishment. It's all documented. So there is a reason why what we're doing is the garnishment process versus the offset that Secretary of State originally had suggested. And then in some cases, other states do. So we had this for a reason, that the debtor receives all of the notifications and they have those abilities to challenge through the garnishment process.
Hi again. If I could just add a tiny bit to that, we would not want, we would ask that you refer people to contact Department of Revenue, just to prevent a lot of garnishment challenges that might not be valid challenges. We want them to contact us first, and if we hear through conversation with them that there's some reason that those funds should not have been garnished, then we can advise them of the garnishment challenge option. But a lot of the time, most garnishment challenges could be not valid, and so we have to have our agents process those challenges. So we would just ask that you refer them over to us, and we are more than happy to answer their questions or concerns about the garnishment.
Okay, so it looks like there is a little more questions. Does the vendor get notification of any outstanding invoices to the state of Oregon? Agencies will be on hold until resolved with DOR. Do they get notice that they're on that list?
I would say that their notice is that DOR has been attempting to collect the debt, and they would have been receiving those types of collection notices, failure to file tax assessments, those kinds of things. Not necessarily that, any future invoice to the state of Oregon is going to be held. This is simply an administrative hold so that the state can issue the garnishment, again, as a legal mechanism for the recoupment of those funds that are owed to the state.
Awesome.
That's correct. There is a correspondence and contact process for the collection division for any debt that they have to go through before the debt is collectible. So they have gone through that full letter process before the debt ends up being garnished. And to add to the prior topic of a vendor, possibly wanting to challenge the garnishment, you can also let them know that in the garnishment packet, there is a list of exempt property that would qualify under a garnishment challenge, so they can read through that information to make that determination.
Chantal, is there a specific place that they should contact, the vendor could contact if they have questions on their garnishment? Do they, do you have an email where we send them, or?
They can just go to www.oregon.gov/DOR, and that's in our section of the slides here. But there is an option to go to the collection section, and there's frequently asked questions in regards to garnishments, whether they are the garnishee or the garnisher. So they can go through there and look at those frequently asked questions, and it also contains all of our contact information, where our main office is, our telephone numbers, and email addresses.
Awesome. I do see that it says it'd be wonderful when the hold goes to SFMS if there was a notification that went out to the vendor. And I think we've already answered that, that Gerald answered it a couple times. Yes, it would be wonderful if it just did, but that there is no correspondence that goes out that way, but they should know that they are already subject to that garnishment. So is there any more questions? We have lots of time still, so if there is any more questions, they can be put in the chat.
Thank you, Amber. And while we're seeing if we've got any more agencies coming up with questions on this, I'll just move us forward to the last slide. There is a link on there that has some additional resource information. So I encourage you to take a look at it. We have frequently asked questions for processing vendor garnishments. We've already covered a lot of the topics that are in there in this training, but if you want to go click on that link, you can see that information. Let us know if you've got any questions on that. And I really want to emphasize, it's great today that we were able to have this joint training, because as you can see, there's multiple different groups involved in this process. So really want to emphasize, if you've got questions on this process, making sure you're contacting the right group. That flow chart that Gerald presented at the beginning kind of shows you the division of responsibilities for those different groups. So if you've got questions on, the OAM, for statewide accounts receivable management, on just kind of that general process in the background. The SWARM email is here. reach out to Gerald. He can provide more information on that. We also have, if you have questions on the RSTARS processing piece, why are vendors inactivating on the 52 screen? How do we set up mail code 444? How do we actually process the garnishment payment in RSTARS? You can reach out to your SFMS analyst. You can reach out to me. We can provide you guidance on that piece of the process. And then if you have questions on revenue online or any of the Department of Revenue piece of the process, we've got that state vendor matching email on there. So we wanted to have this joint training because I know, sometimes those lines might get blurred. I know I get questions related to some of those other groups. I'm sure Gerald and Chantel do as well. So we really want to emphasize, there are multiple contact available to you, depending on what type of question you have on the process. So I'm going to pause here and turn my camera off. We're going to stay on the call for a while. We have plenty of time left, so as questions come in, we'll continue to answer them.
So there is a clarifying question from a previous topic. If a vendor is temporarily activated for non-garnishable payments and another agency is making a garnishable payment, they wouldn't receive the error message to contact DOR. There is nothing agency 2 can do to catch it, right?
Right. And when we talk to, SWARM about figuring out this process and how we were going to manage this, that is a potential risk. If you're not looking at the vendor profile, you do business with this vendor all the time, you're entering in your transaction to the regular vendor mail code, and that vendor has been temporarily activated by another agency to be able to process a non-garnishable payment, you won't get that error message when you're entering the transaction that the vendor's inactive. The contact DOR information will still be on the profile, but we are aware there is that slight timing. It's a small gap. We're just entering it for that day, but that is something we are aware of and thought through when designing that process.
Yeah,
and hopefully,
to add to that.
Oh,
sorry.
Sorry. I was just saying to add to that too, we're hoping that doesn't occur that frequently. We're hoping that those are few and far between with the process we have in place.
Yeah, and when the executive order came and we started this process, we understood that there was that risk, and this is a process that was, shall we say, the most reasonable to implement without creating a lot more programming on the back end that would have added a lot more cost to this. So it can happen. No agency is going to be held accountable because they didn't catch it because the vendor was active on the day that they attempted to make their payment, so they didn't enter their information to revenue online. But again, if you see when you're making your entries that there is that contact DOR, even if the vendor is active, you can still contact DOR, enter your information, and see what the response is. They may or may not issue the garnishment based on that time.
I see another question. What if the vendor ID is inactive and please contact DOR status, but the address is incorrect because of the change of business? How to proceed? So if you have a vendor profile and they have a change of address, you need some sort of change to that vendor profile and it has contact DOR listed on line 4. You would still follow the same process to submit a change request to the vendor desk to update the address. They're not going to remove that contact DOR. They're not going to activate it if it's in inactive status. But if there needs to be an update to the vendor's address, you would still process it as normal. Let me know if that answered your question or if you've got any additional questions on that. But always that line address for the contact DOR, we are never manually removing it. The programming will automatically remove that message when the vendor drops off the vendor list and it becomes back in active status. So that's really the signal that there's some sort of potential garnishment for that vendor. But if you still have changes of addresses or name changes or anything that you would normally do to manage your vendors, we would still process those as normal. Just confirmation question, is it fair to say if an agency receives a garnishment letter from DOR, process it appropriately with mail code 444 regardless of inactive or active status of the vendor? I would say yes, that's accurate. And Chantel noted, if for some reason too much money goes to DOR, more was garnished, they will refund the overpayment to the vendor. Is that accurate, Chantel?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. Amber, at this point, I think we're probably safe to stop recording. I really want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're still going to answer questions if they come in. We can still hold on a little bit longer, but it seems like the pace of the questions may be slowing down a bit. So I just want to say thank you very much. If you have other things you need to get